Thank you.
Okay, good evening everyone. I'm Robert Brindley, your County Councillor, and this is Prue Boswell, your Mayor, who I'm delighted to come along and join us this evening as well. And this, of course, is Peter Tatchell. When I heard that Peter was coming to Totnes for the first Totnes Pride event tomorrow, I thought that as he is the Green Party's human rights spokesperson, I couldn't miss the opportunity of inviting him to give us a talk this evening as well. I'm delighted to welcome Peter this evening to deliver his talk, Human Rights versus Human Wrongs. As most of you will know, Peter is one of the most well-known human rights campaigners in Britain. He has focused the media spotlight not only on gay and lesbian rights, but also on the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, of the victims of racial discrimination and torture. His attempts to make citizens' arrests of Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe were especially memorable. His campaigns continue today through the work of the Peter Tatchell Foundation, whose work we are supporting through donations this evening and through the takings from the talk this evening. Before I hand over to Peter to give his talk this evening, I'd first like to invite John Price here, who is organising the Totnes Pride event tomorrow, to say a little bit about the event tomorrow, for which I and Prue and Peter will all be attending, and maybe many of you as well. Over to you, John.
Hello everyone. Excuse my sweaty and kind of messy nature. We're just obviously in the Civic Hall at the moment, trying to transform it into kind of something really special for tomorrow. Yeah, just wanted to kind of repeat, having Peter Tatchell kind of come to obviously the first ever Totnes Pride event, and it's just a huge honour for me and Matt, who's my twin brother, who's helping me, well, he's kind of supporting us and doing Totnes Pride. It's like, it's not even the cherry on the cake, it's the cherry in the icing and the little sprinkly bits. For us, Peter is not only, a fabulous human being doing wonderful things, but also doing things that actually make a bit of a stir, which actually brave, forward-thinking people are. That's what they do. They cause a stir and they get people talking and they get a dialogue happening. And I just think he's an absolute legend. And I think he's fabulous. To say, obviously, we've had a bit of press, which has been brilliant for Pride and my ego, and but obviously Totnes Pride, the first ever, tomorrow, 11:30 to 4:30 in the Civic Hall just across the road, and then from 8 till 8 in the South Devon Arts Centre, which is just in the industrial estate in Totnes. It really is open to everyone, so whether you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender or not, you are welcome. You are welcome to this Pride, and we hope that the people that come see that our community does exist in Totnes, does exist in rural areas, and is not only a thriving LGBT community, but one that is worthwhile, one that is diverse, of all ages, of all genders, and of all personalities. And I think we've tried our best to showcase that and to showcase that in tomorrow's Pride. So please come along and support it, because I know Totnes is about forward thinking. It's about inclusivity, and I think it's about time that we had Pride here as well. So looking forward to see you all tomorrow. I apologise, but I must go and put some bunting up, because that's what I've been doing for the last few weeks.
Thank you,
Bye. Good talk. See you.
Well, first of all, my apologies. This is the first time I've been to Totnes for about 30 years. So a visit has been long overdue, and I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you all for coming out on this Friday evening, a rather wet Friday evening, but hopefully the warmth we'll generate tonight will compensate for that. The theme of the talk is human rights versus human wrongs, and what I really wanted to share with you tonight is a snapshot of some of the progress we've made and some of the progress we have still yet to make. So I guess my starting point is to think back when I was a young teenager, what life was like. And when you go back to the 50s and 60s, you think to yourself, Britain was a very monocultural society. there was a very, very clear and rather same British identity. Yet here we are today, half a century later, and most of us have embraced the idea of a multicultural society where we recognise there are many different people who make up and contribute to this great country. And the enrichment of those different communities and cultures has, I believe, been to the enrichment of us all. It's made our country a more interesting, more diverse, richer society, culturally and in every other way. But of course, that wasn't how it was. I can remember when I first came to Britain in 1971, where there was very widespread discrimination against Irish people, for example. I mean, you know, Britain and Ireland, our histories are intertwined. It's often not been a happy interrelationship, but, you know, the transference of populations, you know, we have a very similar common heritage as part of the British Isles. And, you know, to think that in those days, in the early 70s, you know, landlords did, not all landlords, but some landlords, refused to hire premises, rent property to Irish people, refused to hire premises to black and ethnic minority people. That was just accepted because there were no laws in those days to prevent such discrimination. Yet over time, we as a nation collectively decided that that kind of discrimination based on race or ethnicity was not British. It wasn't part of our culture and value system. So we passed laws to prohibit race discrimination. And then a bit later, we decided to recognise that discrimination against women, you know, half of humanity, discrimination against women was also not acceptable. So we had the Sex Discrimination Act, and eventually later the Equal Pay Act. We decided that women who work should have the same right to pay as their male counterparts, to overcome a situation where so often women doing exactly the same job would get perhaps 40%, 50%, 60% of their male counterparts. Of course, even to this day, we still don't have absolute parity because, on average, women's earnings are about 15% or so less than men. But we have made huge progress nonetheless. Likewise, in that period, until actually quite recently, there were no laws to protect disabled people against discrimination. You know, if someone was in a wheelchair or had some other kind of disability, there was no facilitation for access. There was no legal requirement to provide access. You know, public services and private services could discriminate. Employers would often not accept valid, qualified, competent disabled people to work for them. So we had to pass laws in the 1990s to ensure that disabled people had equal access, to ensure that they had the right to do a job and should not be barred just because of a disability, and particular disability which in many cases in the past had no bearing on their ability to do the job. Even more recently, we've now got new laws to protect people against discrimination based on faith or belief. So people who have a religious faith or an atheist belief or any other kind of belief now have protection against discrimination, because we recognise that in a diverse multicultural society there are people with many different perspectives, and those perspectives have a right to be held. Those people should not face discrimination based on what they believe. Also, of course, we now have new laws to protect lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people against discrimination. Yet in the past, in fact the very recent past, just over a decade ago, there was no protection. Until 2003, an employer could refuse to hire someone or could fire them because they were lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender. There was no legal protection. And I had friends in the 1970s and 80s who were refused jobs or sacked from their jobs because of their sexual orientation. And they had no legal redress whatsoever. It wasn't until 2007, 2008 that legal discrimination in the provision of goods and services, for example, advertising, hotels, entertainment facilities, it wasn't until 2007, 2008 that kind of discrimination was finally outlawed against people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. It wasn't until just under a decade ago that transgender people were able to lawfully change their gender and get a gender recognition certificate to recognise that they're transformed from the sex they were designated at birth, which they didn't identify with, to the sex that they felt they really truly were. So we've made huge, enormous changes right across the whole sphere of equality and diversity. I think we've made our society a much kinder, more tolerant, more liberal society. And whether we've been ourselves part of any of those groups or communities that have benefited from these new laws, I think we all have benefited because we are a more tolerant, liberal society. And I particularly think about the struggle for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender freedom. Of course, the gains won have been phenomenal in terms of greater equality. When you think in 1999, or until 1999, Britain had by volume, by number, the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country on earth. People think that homosexuality was decriminalised or even legalised in 1967. It wasn't. It was a very partial, narrow decriminalisation, and all the anti-gay laws that had historically existed remained on the statute books. The criminalisation of homosexuality only ended in Britain in 2003 with the passage of the Sexual Offences Act of that year. Until then, the law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895 remained on the statute books. And in 1989, when I did some research, at great effort and with considerable government obstruction, when I did some research to look at the enforcement of anti-gay laws, I found to my shock and horror that the number of gay and bisexual men who are being convicted of entirely consenting, victimless behaviour when no one was harmed and no one complained was almost as great in 1989 as in 1954-55, at a time when homosexuality was totally illegal and when the country was gripped by an hysterical McCarthyite-style anti-gay witch hunt. And why was that? Well, we had a Conservative government which had proclaimed a commitment to, quote, Victorian values. Margaret Thatcher said she wanted to return to Victorian values. And of course, in the Victorian era, homosexuality was very heavily repressed. Then when that phase finished, she introduced the Family Values campaign. Again, to reiterate traditional family values, which according to her had no place for LGBT people. And then to cap it all off, in 1987, at the Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister of the day, Margaret Thatcher, attacked the right to be gay and said there was no such right. She was saying to a whole class of citizens, you don't have a right to be gay. There is no such right, she said. And that, together with the panic and hysteria around HIV and AIDS, which, if you remember, was often depicted as a gay plague, that was a green light to the police. Hence the huge spike in arrests and convictions of gay and bisexual men for entirely consenting victimless behaviour. Now, I mentioned that the Oscar Wilde law remained on the statute book until 2003. So did the law prohibiting anal sex, which was passed in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII. It wasn't repealed until 2003. Unbelievable. But in this period since 1999, all those anti-gay laws have progressively been repealed. most recently, of course, the ban on same-sex marriage. Now, many people think that this ban has always existed. It hasn't. Until 1971, there was no ban on same-sex marriage. Under the 1949 Marriage Act, there was no stipulation that married partners had to be male and female. What happened was, in 1970, the transgender woman April Ashley, who I had the great honour of meeting just 2 nights ago at the Deputy Prime Minister's reception, she tried to marry her male partner. And because she was deemed to be biologically male, according to her birth certificate, the government did not want to allow her to marry to establish a precedent. So it introduced the ban on same-sex marriage in 1971. So this recent repeal with the new same-sex marriage bill takes into account a very recent phenomenon. It reverts to a situation that we had before, where LGBT people can legally get married, and those first marriage ceremonies will take place next summer. So I think the struggle for LGBT rights is, if you like, a snapshot of the wider, broader struggle for everyone's human rights. For the right of black and ethnic minority people, of Irish people, of women, disabled people, of people of faith and no faith, and so on. You know, we have become a global trendsetter in so many of the laws we now have. You know, we've gone from being relatively backward, particularly compared to the Scandinavian countries, to being right up there in the forefront of countries around the world who have really made a commitment to equality, diversity, and human rights for all. Many of you will remember that in 2010, the then Labour government passed the Equality Act, which I think, together with the Human Rights Act, is probably the one of the most important, significant legislations of the last half century. Prior to the Equality Act, we had a patchwork of diverse equality laws. We had special laws for black and ethnic minority people, special laws for women, special laws for disabled people, special laws for LGBT people, special laws for people of faith and belief. But they were all different laws. And at one level, the race laws were the strongest and most comprehensive, and all the others were to varying degrees less good, less effective, less efficient, less comprehensive. And what the Equality Act did was bring all these laws together under a single legal framework, based on the principle that every single person in Britain, regardless of who they are, has a guarantee of equal treatment and protection against discrimination. So the Equality Act goes beyond the previous categories and previous legislations to make it comprehensive for every single citizen. And that, I think, sends a very important signal that we all are equal human beings, that we all deserve the same rights and the same protections, and that if we suffer disadvantage or exclusion, we have a mechanism for legal redress. And that's a huge, huge step forward, because I think in the past, having had special laws for special groups was in many ways divisive. It set different groups against each other. Now we have this unified approach. I think it brings us together and recognises our common humanity. In terms of the future, I just want to share with you just one very simple idea. I believe that to tackle prejudice, a key role rests with the education system. I'm not saying it's only the responsibility of our schools. There's also a responsibility of parents, of politicians, of the media, and many others. But schools can play a very, very important role. Now, my understanding is, when you go to school, it's all about education. Education to prepare you for adult life. You know, to give you numeracy, literacy, an understanding of our history and culture, but also a set of moral and ethical values. So what I'd like to see is lessons in equality and diversity from the very first year of primary school and each successive year. And not as an add-on or an option, but as a central, mandatory part of the national curriculum, applying to state schools and state-funded schools, but also to free schools, independent schools and academies. To teach young people about equality and diversity, I think, is a fundamental part of citizenship, a fundamental part of preparing young people for adult life. We all know young people are not born bigoted, they become bigoted. And if we can counter that at an early age, to give them an acceptance and understanding of racial and religious difference, of gender and sexuality difference, if we can counter that from an early age, I think we will produce more mature, compassionate adults and a more harmonious, cohesive society. Now, my challenge to the government and to local education authorities around the country is, what are you doing to enable that to happen? What are you doing to help educate young people, the new generation, so they grow up without some of the prejudices that some older people have? How can we make our society more cohesive, understanding and accepting of difference? I'm not too sure whether Totnes is ready or Devon is ready for the challenge, but you know, you could lead the way. For those who have influence with the Education Committee, you know, you could be pioneering equality and diversity lessons in these schools. And you know, when I say equality and diversity lessons, I want the lessons, but I also want exams. I'm not a fetishist about exams. I don't want to overburden our young people with examinations, but unless there are exams, I don't think the equality and diversity lessons will be taken seriously. They'll be seen as, you know, a frippery, you know, a sideshow. And I want to see those results put on the school report, and I'd like to see the results of people's equality and diversity exams made mandatory when people apply for jobs. Now, if you have exams and it has to go forward to prospective employers, then both young people and teachers will take them seriously. They'll take it serious. This is a serious subject. This is as important as mathematics or English or any other subject. And I think it would produce a real mind change in people's attitude towards these issues. Greater minds than me, of course, can work out how the exams should work out and what the curriculum and you know, syllabus should be on these issues. But I think the principle is quite clearly there. It's a way to go to make a new generation of young people understand the importance of difference. Now, to me, the right to be different is a fundamental human right. The idea we all have to be the same, that's of a past era. But of course, the right to be different has its limits. You know, it's great to be different. You have a right to be different, but none of your right to be different infringes upon the rights of others. So it's about balancing the right to be different with also a commitment to the common good, the common humanity. So different people with different cultures will have different perspectives. But for example, I don't want to pick out any particular minority group, but you know, female genital mutilation, that is not a right of difference that I would want to see defended. That's a right of difference that is wrong. It needs to be challenged. The same with honour killings and things like that. These are cultural differences. They come out of people from different cultures. I respect the cultures, I respect the people, but not particular practices which harm people within those communities and indeed other communities. So it's about getting the balance right. But the basic principle is the right to be different. So finally, I'd just like to take a look at maybe beyond Britain to the global stage. I've mentioned that we've made great progress and we are now right up the front there in countries leading the way on equality, diversity and human rights. But of course the picture in so many other countries is very, very, very different. We have a United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. one of the great historic outstanding documents ever devised by humanity. A true signal of civilization, that we've been able to set down these principles and seek to uphold them. Now, a lot of people think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was devised by Western people. It wasn't. Yes, it came out of Western tradition of the Enlightenment, but the people who drafted it included people from all continents, from all different cultures. And of course today, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is signed up to by every single of the 193 member states of the United Nations. They're all committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the principle is, you're committed to it, but are you actually upholding it? And sadly, right across the world today, we see so often countries that have signed the Universal Declaration but are not upholding it. And there are obviously graduations. You know, we have countries like the United States, often described as the greatest democracy in the world, which still has the death penalty. Where, we see a disproportionate number of young black men incarcerated and facing the death penalty for crimes often based on flimsy evidence, often based on judicial processes where the trial process, the legal representation, has fallen far short of what most of us would expect in a trial to produce a result that was beyond reasonable doubt. With the United States in Guantanamo Bay, people are being held for years without charge, let alone trial. Sheikh Ahmed, a British resident, has been held in Guantanamo Bay for over 11 years. He's never been charged with anything. Never been charged. This violates the fundamental principle that people have a right to swift and secure justice. Even here in Britain, we have some problems with aspects of the so-called war on terror. Thanks to Edward Snowden, we're now aware of the mass snooping on our private correspondence by Britain's main security agency, GCHQ. GCHQ has been snooping on our emails, on our phone records, without our knowledge, and most importantly, without parliamentary debate or approval. This has been done in secret. Entirely in secret, without the consent of the people or Parliament. We have a whole raft of secret courts that operate in so-called terror cases. And some of them, some of the cases brought are entirely justified. But the principle of secret courts goes against the fundamental principles of British justice, which the people of this country have fought long and hard for. I've been involved in some terrorism trials, and I've been shocked to see the way in which flimsy evidence has been used to bring people to trial. I'll just give you just one example. For many years, I've worked to support the people of Balochistan, which is a region of Pakistan, which was annexed by Pakistan and has been held under military occupation for the last 60 years. The people there never voted to be part of Pakistan. They've been fighting a freedom struggle all these years. They are subject to the most horrendous human rights abuses. Some years ago, when the military dictator Pervez Musharraf was in power, two of my colleagues who are from Balochistan, who are human rights defenders, who have never been involved or charged with any kind of violent terrorist offences, were arrested and, I would say, quote, framed on charges of terrorism for reasons I can only speculate. The speculation is that they were very effective in exposing Pakistan's human rights abuses in Balochistan and using London as a base to get that information out. These poor guys were charged with terrorism offences. In Britain, they were stuck in Belmarsh high security prison on the flimsiest of evidence. And it just so happens shortly after, the military dictator of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, was demanding their arrest and threatening that if Britain didn't arrest them, he would halt all cooperation in the war on terror. You can draw your own conclusion. If I had not got those two men, the best lawyers in the country, Gareth Peirce, well known to many of you, Dame Helena Kennedy, if those people had not been taking on this case, those men would have almost certainly been convicted and now be serving very long prison sentences. In the end, because they had good legal representation, and fortunately because they had an honest, open-minded jury, they were acquitted of all charges. But that gives you an example of how even here in Britain, despite the fact that overall we do have a good record on human rights, or a record that's better than many other countries, still we have flaws and failings. Right now, of course, we have horrendous human rights abuses being perpetrated in Syria, mainly by the forces of President Assad, but also to some extent by some of the rebels. I'm often, outraged the way in which the media will talk about both sides in the Syrian conflict. There aren't two sides in the Syrian conflict, there are several. There is President Assad, there is, and his regime, there are also the jihadists and Al-Qaeda, there are also moderate Islamists who broadly support democratic principles, perhaps not entirely to our agreement, but they're not hardline extremists. And then we have the Syrian democratic left and secular opposition, who share entirely our human rights values. And what we have is constantly a conflation between the jihadists and fundamentalists and Al-Qaeda with the democratic left, secular, and the moderate Islamists. There is a real movement in Syria, which is not being reported, a peaceful, non-violent movement against President Assad that does support a new democratic disposition for that country. It's not being heard, sadly. In terms of what to do, well, I don't believe, based on the experience, particularly in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I never supported, I don't believe that Western intervention would either be morally justified or appropriate or effective. I think any action has to be done under the auspices of the United Nations. If not through the Security Council, then through a debate and vote in the General Assembly, which I'm very surprised there hasn't been. Now, of course, there still is the issue about the Security Council having a veto, but if the General Assembly voted for action, the moral pressure on the Security Council would be ramped up very considerably. I don't have a magic solution, but I do think that it would be credible and possible for the United Nations to enforce a no-fly zone and impose an arms embargo. Those are two key things to help de-escalate the conflict. If the arms stopped pouring in and there was a no-fly zone, that would be a massive de-escalation. And then further, I'd like to see the United Nations establish civilian safe havens within the country and in neighbouring countries, and send in peacekeepers to try and stand between the warring factions. Now, obviously, that's an ideal. The practical implementation is difficult. But I think we have to, or it would be desirable, if we push the idea of those kind of measures and build a movement, a grassroots movement in this country and around the world for those kinds of alternative policies. Alternatives to doing nothing and alternatives to Western intervention. The other thing I'm really surprised it hasn't happened is that the International Criminal Court should be issuing arrest warrants for crimes against humanity against Assad and his regime, and against some of the Al-Qaeda jihadist rebels as well, who certainly have been guilty also of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, once again, the issue is about enforcement. But the important thing is for the International Criminal Court to send a signal that these are crimes against humanity, and that it will seek to pursue those responsible. That would be a very important symbolic gesture. It would send a signal loud and clear that carrying on and getting away with it is not an option. You all remember that the International Criminal Court, or the Special Tribunal rather, for the former Yugoslavia, issued an arrest warrant for Slobodan Milosevic. At the time, he didn't have any idea how it would be enforced or executed. But eventually, of course, he was taken to The Hague. And it sent a signal to him and those around him, the world is gunning for you. Well, not literally gunning, but the world is after you, the world is after you. You are going to be held to account. And I think that, this measure, is something that the International Criminal Court should pursue to send a signal, a wake-up call, to tell Assad and his lieutenants, there is a judicial process, we are coming for you, we are going to seek your prosecution, you can run and you can hide for a while, but sooner or later, there is at least a possibility that you'll be caught. And if only the International Criminal Court did this more often, I believe for some tyrants and torturers, it might make them think twice. It might act as a deterrent. In terms of execution, problematic and difficult, but I would say that in theory, I would have no objection for the International Criminal Court to issue a valid arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and to authorise its implementation. We know from the Israeli raid on Entebbe, or the raid on Abbottabad to get Osama bin Laden, that special forces have great capacities. I don't know whether they could get Assad and some of the rebel commanders, but it certainly is a possibility. And I would find no objection to a limited, incursion under International Criminal Court sanction by special forces to get Assad and some of the rebel commanders and take them to The Hague. I would not support unilateral action by Britain and the United States, but under the authorization of the International Criminal Court, I think that's perfectly justified. Finally, perhaps just turning to another country, Russia. As many of you know, there's a lot of focus right now on the new anti-gay law that's been passed in Russia, which basically criminalizes any public expression of LGBT identity or any advocacy of LGBT human rights. The law, interestingly, curiously, specifically says that it is criminal to propose any equal validity of heterosexuality and homosexuality. It goes on to say that any attempt to project homosexuality as, quote, attractive or interesting is also a crime. Now this is being promoted under the fig leaf of protecting minors, i.e. in Russian law, a person under 18. But that's just a cover. Already a young man who held up a sign saying homosexuality is normal was prosecuted and convicted on this law, even though there was no evidence that a person under 18 saw it. So this is quite clearly part of an anti-gay push by the Putin regime. But it's not in isolation. This is part of a much wider crackdown on civil society in Russia. Many of you will have heard about the arrests of opposition leaders, the framing of them on false charges. You will have heard about the breakup of peaceful protests, even protests by senior citizens protesting against the falling rates of their pension, falling values of their pensions, have been violently broken up by President Putin's goons. There's also increasing state control of the media, harassment of journalists, lawyers and human rights defenders. So the attack on LGBT rights is not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of a much broader attack on civil and human rights, which is tragic because as much of the rest of the world is moving forward towards greater acceptance and enforcement of human rights, Russia is moving backward. President Putin is not Stalin, but he's certainly adopting some of those methods, and projecting himself as a strong man. A strong man with some very curious iconography. All that riding barebacked and bare-chested, shooting with guns, you know, fishing and scuba diving and so on. I think the man protests his masculinity a bit too much. He just recently divorced his wife. I have no idea what he's talking about. But, you know, it's quite clearly that there's some really funny macho thing going on there, and you know, why LGBT people should be targeted in this way is curious. They're not a sizable minority. You know, there are no, you know, so far been no threat to the regime. You know, why? Well, I think it's partly because of the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very closely aligned to the Putin regime. And you know, they've got a symbiotic relationship where the church supports the regime supports the church. There's also, of course, the issue of you know, great Russian nationalism. There's a huge revival of the chauvinistic Russian mentality of the 19th century and earlier. You know, the idea that Russia is great and macho and powerful, the strongman leader. That mentality, that kind of politics, is definitely under revival in Putin's Russia. And in those circumstances, LGBT people are seen as a threat to that masculinization of politics. The same with women, you know, increasingly, you know, the idea that women's place is to be mothers, and there's this big scare story about, you know, the falling birth rate, and that women who don't have children, LGBT people, are a threat to the demographics of the country. This is a major political point in Russia today, and it does indicate, I think, a great deal of insecurity, above all else, a great deal of insecurity about Russian identity, and perhaps that is partly in response to the collapse of communism and, you know, the overarching ideology that provided. Perhaps it's also, I think, a response to the uncertainty and insecurity that has resulted from the recapitalization of Russian society, the resurgence of a kleptomaniac capitalism, a ruthless kind of capitalism which has led to oligarchs getting huge power and wealth, basically looting state assets. And people, I think, feel very powerless. There's been, you know, for a period there was great economic dislocation, many people lost their jobs, inflation was soaring, all the old certainties were falling apart, pensions, the value of pensions plummeted. In those circumstances, you know, a lot of Russian people, in my view, misguidedly, are grasping for strong leadership to restore order, and that is often the way in which things do proceed in periods of economic recession, uncertainty, and downturn. So, across the globe, we're in a situation where so many countries pay lip service, if that, to human rights, but in reality treat their own citizens and other citizens from other neighbouring countries or parts of countries that have been forcibly incorporated with great disrespect and even oppression. And I think about, you know, not just Balochistan, but also it'll apply to the people in West Papua who have been annexed and occupied by Indonesia for 60 years, the Western Sahara, which has been recolonized by Morocco after the Spanish left. There are so many parts of the world where national minorities are underrepresented, unrepresented, or even outright oppressed. You know, the lines on the maps, which were drawn for the most part by the imperial Western powers, often bear no relation to the actual reality of people's lives and sense of identity. And a good example, of course, are the Kurdish people, you know, now split between Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. They are homeless, stateless people, yearning for nationhood, yearning for their own self-rule. Yet, because of the way the lines draw on the map, they are stateless minorities within their own powers that were bequeathed to them by the legacy of colonialism. So there's a lot of work to be done yet before we can secure a better world. But I want to finish on just one positive note. Many of you will be familiar with the chaos and terrorism and human rights abuses in Somalia. What you may not be familiar with is the positive experience of Somaliland. Somalia was created in the 1960s out of two protectorates, the British Protectorate and the Italian Protectorate. In the 1960s they merged to form Somalia. And then under Said Barre, who started off as not too bad a guy, a nationalist, a social justice program, but soon descended into chaos and dictatorship. So in 1991, I think, Somaliland, as was, broke away to establish its own independent state, to revert to its status before it merged with Somalia. And what has been so extraordinary compared to Somalia is that Somaliland has established a functioning parliamentary democracy. The civil war has ended long ago. There's free press, the right to protest. There have been a few small glitches where some journalists were arrested and some opposition people were harassed, but the people rose up and demanded the government respect human rights, and the government backed down. So Somaliland is a fantastic example of a Muslim and African success story. In contrast to the stories of war and chaos and tyranny and underdevelopment, we're seeing in Somaliland a new re-emerged nation that is progressing towards great economic development, has democracy, has human rights. It's a wonderful story. But sadly, the international community won't recognise it. It says we have to respect the old borders. The borders drawn up by imperialism have to be respected, they say. Well, these are, I say, artificial borders drawn on a map by colonial administrators in London or Paris or wherever. No. We need to be pushing for Somaliland to get its just recognition. The Commonwealth won't recognise it. The United Nations won't recognise it. Britain won't recognise it, although the British government has been persuaded to give some measured support. Low-key, nowhere near enough, but some support to Somaliland. But it is a real optimistic success story. Not perfect, but a real example of how a Muslim and African nation can make progress. And I think we need to sing those success stories as well as recognise the tyranny that still exists and the changes that need to be made. So thank you, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Peter, for a fascinating and inspiring and exceptionally wide-ranging talk. Your grand tour has taken us from the UN Declaration of Human Rights to Baluchistan and Syria and Guantanamo Bay and Russia and the marriage equality and a proposal for school exams on prejudice and discrimination. I imagine we're going to have an extremely wide range of questions arising from that. Can I suggest that I take sort of 3 questions at a time?
Just one at a time might be easier. I'll explain why. As you know, I've had my fair share of beatings by the National Front and by the BNP, but particularly by very badly beaten in the head by President Mugabe's bodyguards in Brussels in 2001 when I was knocked unconscious, and then again in Moscow in 2007 when I was badly beaten by neo-Nazis. So one of the side effects is I've got a bit of brain damage, and it does affect my memory and concentration. So I might be able to do 3 questions at a time, but
one at a time.
Probably the safer one at a time.
I think your suggestion about the education, about diversity, is a brilliant one. But may I make a plea for it to include sex education, because a lot of people in this room might not be aware that Section 28, the much hated Section 28, is still being enacted by some schools. Back in the late 70s, when I was a teenager, it was never suggested to me that being lesbian was even remotely an option. And then in 1984, when I was a young lesbian in a young lesbian group in Brighton, we as a group wrote to every girls' school and secondary school in the county, in Sussex, inviting them to have us come and give a presentation and a talk and maybe a workshop with their kids to show them that, you know, being lesbian or gay was actually a viable option for them. And not one of them took us up on this. And since then, of course, we've had Section 28, and then it's been repealed. But nevertheless, even in this day and age, there are many schools that do not offer this. And this is general schools, this is not even faith schools, and let's face it, faith schools, it's even worse. They're not actually giving young people viable options and effectively closeting those kids by making them attend a sex education programme that not only doesn't deal with issues of sexuality, but also doesn't deal with issues of domestic violence either. And I listened to David Heath on Radio 4 a week or so ago when someone was saying to him, we should, on our sort of lifestyles and relationships aspect of sex education, we should be addressing domestic abuse, which is as bad as it ever was back in the 1980s. And he blustered on and said all lots of good things, but basically wouldn't agree to do it. So our sex education in schools, in all the schools, but especially faith schools as well, is seriously, sadly lacking and letting down young people big time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues is that sex and relationship education is no longer compulsory in schools. So many schools will either opt out or they will do a perfunctory class or lesson once in a while.
The Michael Gove approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting that every time young people are surveyed about this, they say that sex and relationship education is inadequate. They want more of it. They want to, particularly more about emotions and feelings. And they feel that what they're getting is just not good enough. You know, even when it comes to safer sex, you know, teaching kids how to roll a condom on a banana is not safer sex. You know, we need to teach young people about how to negotiate safer sex. What do you do if your boyfriend or partner won't wear a condom? You know, how do you deal with that? What are the arguments or you know, strategies you can use to try and persuade them? You know, amazingly, hardly any schools in this country deal with issues of child sexual abuse. You know, telling kids to phone Childline is not enough. You know, young people need to be empowered with the confidence, it's my body, I've got a right to say yes to sex, I've also got a right to say no. And to give them the skills and confidence so they do feel able to say no to unwanted sexual advances and harassment. And then to report abuses. And you know, the trouble is, most sexual abuse is not coercive. It's about persuasion and manipulation, and it's about secrecy, and it's about shame. The evidence shows that young people who are ashamed about sex are the ones least likely to report abuse. So if you can overcome sexual guilt and shame, young people are much more likely to report abuse. And it just seems so obvious, but we don't have a government or education authorities willing to take those issues on. Of course, a lot of government and education authority people are afraid of the reaction of parents. But, you know, that's a two-edged sword. A lot of parents say it's my responsibility, but then when they're asked about it, they say they don't feel confident or they're embarrassed. So we know that lots of parents don't give their children adequate sex and relationship education, so it does have to fall to the schools. We know there is an issue about whether parents should have the right to opt out. I don't think they should. You know, you shouldn't have a right to take your kids out of mathematics classes or English language classes. Why should you have the right to take the kids out of sex and relationship classes? what we should do is learn from Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is the leader in this. They have the parental opt-out, so parents can opt to take their kids out of sex and relationship education, but they require the parent to come to the school for each individual lessons and take their kid out. And almost no parents do. Almost no parents do. So in Northern Ireland, I'm not saying the quality of the sex education is adequate, but the attendance rates are much higher. I think it's a very, very good idea, which I'd like to see adopted in England and Wales and Scotland.
How do we compare to other European countries in that respect?
It's very patchy, but by comparison to the Netherlands or Scandinavian countries, our sex education is very, very poor. Very poor. I mean, I don't know what the precise, most recent statistics are, but until a few years ago, quite clearly it wasn't working because the rates of teenage pregnancies, unwanted teenage pregnancies in Britain, was something like 11 times higher than the Netherlands, and the rate of teenage abortions was, I think, 7 times higher. So, something's wrong there. And it's interesting, the Dutch experience has been for the last probably 20 years, has been to go for very explicit, not in every school, but in most schools, quite explicit sex and relationship education, based around the principle, it's your body, it's your right to control it. No one has the right to force or pressure you to do anything. You can have sex, but you can also not have sex. It's your choice. So it's very much about empowering young people, giving them the confidence to make their own choices and not be pressured. Now, some of you may know that until fairly recently, the age of consent in the Netherlands was effectively 12 for both heterosexual and homosexual relationships, with the qualification unless the children complained, or unless the parents complained, or unless the social workers complained. But in reality, it was 12. But the reality was, in practice, young Dutch teenagers had their first sexual intercourse later on average than young British teenagers. So they were given the option, the power, to say yes or to say no, but most of them, given the information they were provided, with this ethos, it's your body, it's your right to control, most of them chose to delay their first sexual experience, or first sexual intercourse. So I think the Dutch are onto something, and I'm not saying, there's obviously some cultural differences, but the Dutch started off with very similar high rates of teenage pregnancies and abortions, high rates of sexually transmitted infections, and so on. And they've completely turned that around in the last 20 years or so.
I want to ask a question, but before I do, I want to make an observation. Because all my life, it has been a total puzzlement to me why we are so dishonest and embarrassed about sex, because we're all here because of it. What's the problem? Anyway, I wanted to ask a question. It goes back to education and teaching children to be accepting about diversity. I think a lot of young people these days do accept, they're more accepting in many ways than the older generation. But the problem we have is that you teach them one thing at school and they accept it when they're with their peers. But what happens when they go home? We really do need to include the families in this, because you have a child who is taught it's okay to accept gender, sex, black people, gay, whatever, but they go home and their parents say, we can't do that, oh that's not, that's not right. How do we deal with that? I know you've got to start somewhere, but it'll take a long time to trickle through. How do we deal with educating the families?
Well, perhaps we become as sophisticated as the people of Somaliland, who when human rights were being broached, they all got up and sorted it out, as Peter was saying.
But it's sorted.
But we're not very sophisticated, are we?
Well, we're dishonest. We don't admit that sex happens in general, the English, that we're a bit sort of, like this about it. But I'm just asking the question, if we have educational diversity in schools, how do we deal when the child goes home, a young child of 12 or 13, goes home and is faced with a parent who is completely anti? How does that child
I think actually if you start, it was suggested much younger, preschool actually. if it's not happening at home, then the child becomes the educator to the parents quite often.
Could be.
And a very, very young child can often be a very effective educator to all of us. So I think we should trust in our children too, as well as in good educators.
Well, I'm trying to say it's the job of us all, really.
Can I just say that people seem to have failed to notice the attitudes we have. It's great to focus on the positive, but a lot of the attitudes are still there, endemic in the system, and in the fact, if you look at schools, there's very little pastoral support. There's very little. There's nowhere for kids to turn to when they've got problems, when they discover their own sexual identities, all of those sorts of things. There's nowhere for them to turn to. Down here, 3 schools, totaling 3,000 children, are dealt with by one person. And most of the time, in my experience, children are just rubbished for their thoughts and their ideas. And it's quite shocking, to the extent also where you have the child support various agencies like the Child Mental Health Agency, CAMS, denying children the existence of their own sort of homosexual leanings. They're very absolutely homophobic, saying to the extent that these things, describing them in actual, this is fact, describing them as phases, and unfortunate phase that the children will grow out of, and see, total belittlement, and I just find this shocking. I think that you did so much for young people. I really do. I was a contemporary of yours in the 80s. I was on many of the same things that you were on, marches and demonstrations and such like, and I think so much was done by yourself and people like you to make children and young people feel that they did have a right to have an identity. Before, they had no right. Before the work you did in particular, they had no rights, and they were rubbished if they were said they had leanings one way or another. And you challenged that and made it so much better for successive generations, but it's still riddled throughout the schools. In many ways, my observation of the schools is that they are archaic. Some things still go right back to Victorian times. Attitudes, children, the way they just don't value children. They're like a subspecies of humanity, and it's awful, and it's mainstream, and it's right over the whole area, and that needs to be tackled before anything else, because that's where people, the families, take their lead from. But that's just, I don't know, maybe other people don't experience that, but that is how I've seen it.
Well, I'll tell you a story. In the early mid-1990s, I wrote a series of articles and quite a lot of programs, including one by Joan Bakewell, Heart of the Matter, which dealt with all these issues about young people's sexuality, and I think it's one of the most mature programs ever made about these issues. But as a result, a German educationalist happened to be in London and saw the program and invited me over to Germany to do a series of experimental sex education programs with selected schools. And this was to try and look at how sex education was taught, and what the boundaries should be and so on. But the remit to me was I could be and should be as explicit as I thought was necessary. And all the kids had to get written permission from their parents. There's 3 schools, one in Munich and 2 in Hamburg. And so I spoke very explicitly about sex and relationships, very explicitly about both heterosexual sex and homosexual sex, about things like how to pleasure your partners, how if you're a boy or a girl and you're with a female partner, what will give them satisfaction and fulfillment, and vice versa. And these were children aged from 12 to 16, and they did evaluations afterwards. And I was really nervous because I thought very explicit stuff, about sexual and all that kind of thing. All these boys, you could see as I was talking, people were thirsting to find out about this. Most of them appeared to have never heard about it before, and they were hungry to get this information. Anyway, the upshot of the report that eventually came out, it was an internal report for the German education system, was that my lessons in particular were the most effective because I'd been honest and upfront with young people. In the question and answer session, they asked all the things they'd been dying to ask someone for years and years and years, but didn't feel confident to ask their parents or their teachers. And because I wasn't a teacher in the school, because I was independent, they felt confident and able.
We gave them respect.
Yeah,
and that's what they don't get now. And if we can't get that, if we can't recognise and respect young people and treat them as equal, then we can't go forward with any of it. That's where the change happens. Your lessons are a brilliant idea. I think there should be even, I can think of a few other subjects to add on to that, but until the actual schools themselves start treating the children as though they have value and that their opinions mean something, it's not going to change. And I'm not saying there aren't some really good teachers out there, because there are. The overall view of a lot of schools I've encountered, I was really disheartened to see that in 40 years or 30 years, whatever, there's not much change been effected, and children are still generally seen as. I mean, I know I speak to them in the parks when I'm out with my son and things, and it's still really bad and it needs changing.
Well, I disagree entirely with that. I've got children and grandchildren, and I find those two generations the most unprejudiced people I've ever met.
They are, but it's not down. I agree.
The children would be amazed that we more older people are meeting tonight and talking about these things, which to young people are not subjects.
That's true.
They get all this stuff from soap operas on the television, particularly from The Simpsons. We've even had homosexuality on the Archers recently, which is absolutely wonderful. Older people seem to find it fascinating. The younger children are completely turned off by it. And the people who are trying to hold the dam and prevent this process happening are of course the established churches, the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. And I'd be interested to ask Peter whether the Archbishop of Canterbury actually hurt him very much when he hit him with his mitre. And whether you think that the established churches are actually worth wasting any thought and time on, or are they a complete waste of time?
Just to finish the point, the other thing that was interesting about that research was the positive response from parents. The educationists were astonished at the positive feedback from parents. Parents said things like, my child for the first time opened up about their sexual and emotional feelings about relationships. So I never knew my child had this relationship with this person, but as a result of your talk, they managed to open up. And so anyway, the Archbishop of Canterbury never hit me with his mitre. In fact, he stood back from the pulpit and allowed me to speak. But I think you're right. Homophobic bullying in our schools is worse in faith schools than any other type of school, and faith schools do the least to challenge it. Now, of course, there are some faith schools and some teachers in faith schools who are good and do address the issue and so on, but overall, it's very, very poor. I think you're right that the influence of organised religion as opposed to individual people of faith does hamper successive governments. Governments are terrified of the religious lobby. And the religious lobby has got a right to lobby, but they don't have a right to veto things. And it's really depressing the way in which, when Tony Blair came to power, one of the first things he did was bring in faith leaders and consult them on every single issue. But civil liberties organisations or human rights groups never had that privileged access.
What do I?
Well, exactly. So that's a real downside. It's being continued, but to a lesser extent under the coalition government. It still is continued, and I think that faith organisations have a right to make their point and so on, but I don't think they have a right to veto. And one of the downsides of the Equality Act, which I mentioned previously, is that it has written into it certain qualified exemptions for faith organisations. They're allowed to discriminate in certain circumstances if they can justify the discrimination as being to uphold their religious ethos. Now, no one else has got that opt-out, and I think it's really wrong for religious organisations to be privileged under the law.
And not to have workshops.
This lady's hand is going dead because she's had it for a long time.
Thank you. The gentleman over there, I'd just like to say in praise of older people who go on learning.
Yes.
I think that maybe education of the quality that you are practicing might go some way towards fighting the influence of pornography on young people's idea of what is normal.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that people are anxious and nervous about the availability of pornography, and of course there are different graduations of pornography. So I've seen some pornography that's quite romantic and sweet, and you think this is the kind of thing that people should see, and it's good education, and gives a good positive value-based idea about relationships. But some of it is very extreme and violent and humiliating and degrading. And I think young people are going to see it. They need to be educated about how to deal with it and how to not expect that that's the kind of way in which they should behave towards their partners, and to not have unrealistic expectations about what is involved in a sexual and emotional relationship. And the government's making some nods in that direction, but again, there's no clear plan for education. It falls back to your point about teachers. I mean, it's astonishing. If you're going to be a mathematics teacher, you have to specialise in mathematics. But if you're going to do sex and relationship education, there's no formal training or support. And that's very unfair to put teachers in that position where they haven't got the formal training and support, they haven't got the backup. Sex and relationship education needs training. It needs support.
Just going back to good old Britain, really. Quality, diversity, human rights for all. I'll just mention legal aid. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I presume you all know about the government's plans revision to legal aid, which, among other things, will reduce the amount of money available for legal aid, but also allow people to be told who will be their legal representative rather than choosing their legal representative. And of course, if you have a specialised case, could be domestic violence, could be racist attacks, could be immigration or asylum, you need a specialist solicitor. Now, with the government's proposals, there's no guarantee that you will get a specialist solicitor. There are, I'm sad to say, many very good solicitors and many sharks. I mean, I deal with a lot in dealing with asylum and immigration cases, and there are some absolutely spot on. They know their business, they've studied well, they do prepare good cases, but there are many who basically treat, particularly asylum seekers, as cash cows. They take the money, they prepare shoddy cases, and that's why so many legitimate refugees fail. It's not because they haven't got a legitimate claim, it's because they've had very poor substandard legal representation, which even before these new reforms had been massively cut and reduced. Under the current proposals, never mind the new ones, it is impossible for a solicitor to prepare an asylum case. To take the statement, to get corroborative evidence, to get medical reports if the person's been victimised, if they've been in detention or in prison or in a foreign country, to get police reports and prison records. That takes time, it takes money. And under the current budget, it is impossible to do. And that's why, sadly, many good, legitimate refugees are being failed and being sent back. It's why some are going on their own and hiding. Not because they're criminals or bad people, because they're desperate not to go back to face more torture and more arrests. And I've seen some shocking examples of this in asylum adjudicating hearings. particularly for LGBT refugees, until fairly recently, until about 2010, judges used to say to LGBT refugees, well, I accept that for someone they would say, someone's been, jailed, tortured, and they'd say, oh, this doesn't amount to persecution. Within the terms of, well, I accept you've been tortured, you've been jailed, so on, your partner's been murdered, but this, in my opinion, does not amount to persecution within the terms of the Refugee Convention. Shocking stuff. What threshold do they expect? Then they used to change. It was, we'll accept, yes, you have been persecuted, but we believe it's safe for you to go back to your home country. You can change your name, you can move to a part of the country where no one knows you, and you can stop having same-sex relationships. Then no one will know you're gay, and you won't be persecuted. But of course, they'd never say that about religious or political or ethnic refugees. Never. So that was overruled in the High Court in 2010. So now what they do is they say, we don't believe you're gay. So if a woman is very pretty and feminine and petite, they'll say, you don't look like a lesbian to me. Or a man's really this guy, a Nigerian guy recently, or last year, very macho, very masculine. The barrister and the judge barefacedly said to him, you don't look like a gay man to me. Very stereotyped something. Or they will ask them, they'll say, well, what magazines do you read? What gay magazines do you read? To someone who can't read English. What gay clubs do you go to? Refugees are destitute. They can't afford to go to gay clubs. So people are being failed. And what's happening now is some people are so desperate that there have been cases where people have had affidavits from their current or former partners, from people in the community who know them, who say, yes, this person's gay, or this person's lesbian, or this person's bisexual or transgender, and still the judges won't believe them. So now, LGBT refugees are resorting to photographing or even filming them having sex with their partners to prove that they are genuinely LGBT. And for these are people who often come from deeply conservative religious backgrounds, who filming and photographing themselves having sex is like just a horrible thing, humiliating, degrading, and unconscionable thing to do. But they're so desperate. So that's a big issue. But again, I'll tell you a positive story. A few years ago, there's a case of an Iraqi doctor who was targeted by Islamist groups in Iraq because they didn't know he was gay, they suspected he was gay. Anyway, one day they threw a hand grenade into his house and then left a note saying, next time you'll be dead. So he decided they're obviously onto him, so he packed up that very night and went and moved to live in the nurses' quarters, to hide in the nurses' quarters, the hospital where he worked in Baghdad. The very same night, they got to his partner and shot him dead in his house. Anyway, he came to Britain only because I was able to support him, to find him a good solicitor, to take him through all the steps he needed to demonstrate the evidence he needed to provide. Only because of that, he eventually got asylum. And he was then decided to find out where he was most needed. And he ended up going to Scotland, even though he'd never been to Scotland before, didn't know anybody there. He went to Scotland and worked in a community where they had no doctor. So he gave something really valuable and useful to our country and to that community in Scotland. They didn't have a doctor, he became the doctor. And he got fantastic community support there, because no doctor wanted to work in that village or that area. So it's a really positive example of the contribution that refugees can make to our society.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, first of all. To take it away from some of the topics we've been talking about a little bit, and towards, obviously you talked about the Equality Act, the first generational rights that are very well developed in this country and have developed over the last 10, 15 years in particular. Do you think the Human Rights Act, does the Green Party think the Human Rights Act is fit for purpose? And if so, does it have any constitutional importance or significance? And what is your position in the sort of forthcoming review, effectively? What are you going to do with that?
Well, the essence is that the Human Rights Act incorporates into British law the European Convention on Human Rights, which was drafted in 1950. At the time, a very far-sighted document, promoted by Winston Churchill as a challenge to tyranny and injustice and oppression that had been witnessed during the Second World War. But of course, it was devised in an era when acknowledgement and understanding of lots of social issues and discriminations were not well understood. So, for example, in Article 14, which lists the grounds of non-discrimination, there's nothing about the rights of disabled people, nothing about the rights of LGBT people, and nothing about new emerging issues like genetic inheritance. With the development of the Human Genome Project and greater understanding of possible genetic influences on diseases, that kind of discrimination based on one's genetic inheritance is a potentially major discrimination in the future, that people who have a genetic predisposition to certain illnesses may find they're paying much higher premiums or not even being insured. So the European Convention is itself not sufficient, and its incorporation into British law is not sufficient. At the time, I argued with the Labour government, look, this is an opportunity to remedy all the deficiencies that now exist, that we're now aware of, that exist in the European Convention. So I proposed a series of clauses that would address those issues. Unfortunately, the Labour government declined. So we're now lumped with... In terms of the government's or the Conservative proposal to ditch the Human Rights Act and to introduce a British Bill of Rights, since they won't say what's in the proposed British Bill of Rights, I'm highly sceptical. For all its flaws, the Human Rights Act is a really important piece of legislation. I would say it's the single most important legislation in Britain in the last 50 years, because it guarantees all of us equal rights, equal protection. It's not perfect, it could and should be improved, but to get rid of it would be a huge error. And whether it's through the Human Rights Act or through the European Convention on Human Rights, what people forget how much those legislations between them have done to advance the rights of our people. I mean, women's rights, pension rights, the rights of LGBT people, disabled people, employees' rights. All these have been advanced through the European Convention or the Human Rights Act. They're all extensions of freedom, equality and non-discrimination. So myself and the Green Party wholly support the Human Rights Act, retaining it, but perhaps at some future date, hopefully improving it. And I think we must be very careful and very resistant to any attempt by any government to try and water it down, let alone repeal it.
Do you think it will be in the Conservative manifesto for the next election, Peter, the abolition?
I would suspect so.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my.
They've been talking about it for 2 or 3 years, and I'd be very surprised if they won't use this as a way to counter UKIP.
Hi. In this sort of time of austerity, it sort of strikes me that there are some issues that I would call rights. I don't know whether they're in the Human Rights Act or not, like the right to a house, the right to food. Those are very basic rights. Are they part of the Human Rights Act? Should they be part? Because in a way, the level that you're talking at seems to be a sort of a grade up from that. But there are these fundamental things. I know people who just haven't got anywhere to live, and that consumes them. How do you respond to that?
Well, all those what I call social and economic rights, they're not in the Human Rights Act. We don't have a constitution, but Britain has signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and those conventions do include precisely those issues: shelter, food, clothing, education, healthcare. They're all enshrined there within those conventions which we as a nation have signed up to. So they can, at least in theory, be used to hold our government to account. To say that we've signed these conventions, we've promised to uphold them, what you're doing violates these principles. Of course, the government would say, well, these are international conventions, we make our own laws, but there is an arguable legal case that, through the courts, you could actually, with proper evidence, in a particular case, hold the government to account for violating some of those principles.
Wouldn't you need legal aid for that?
Well, legal aid or some wealthy benefactor or some lawyer willing to do it pro bono.
I mean, I just think that if that could happen, say on housing, for example, that could actually change life for so many people.
Yeah.
Well, this is what's been happening. I'm sorry, this woman from the UN, this big scandal. She's been just like at the right time, just kind of bringing all that. And obviously the government didn't like it.
Coming from prison.
It's not bedroom tax, isn't it?
Yes. So
I think it is a mistake to see human rights narrowly in terms of just civil liberties and freedoms. Human rights are, as you say, the right to food and clean water and so on. I mean, here I am drinking glasses of water. It tastes quite nice. It quenches my thirst. It's not going to kill me. But tonight and every night, 10,000 parents will bury a child who's died from drinking dirty water. And in a world of plenty, how can we possibly justify not providing safe, clean drinking water to all the world's people? All the world's people. Near 1,000 million people on this planet will go to bed tonight hungry or malnourished. Again, just unbelievable when we spend, as a planet, all the governments of the world spend $1.6 trillion a year on weapons and war. 1.6 trillion. These are mind-boggling sums. One of the campaigns I've sort of been working on is, I call the 10% campaign, which is to try and get global agreement to reduce military spending by 10%. I'd like to reduce it by 100%, but I know it's not realistic, but 10%. And for the governments of the world to put that money into a global fund to combat poverty. 10% of $1.6 trillion is every year 160,000 million $160,000 million a year. If we just reduce military spending by 10% and put it into a fund to combat global poverty, within 20 or 30 years, we could provide safe, clean drinking water, we could end all malnutrition and hunger, we could solve all preventable diseases, and we could provide basic education and healthcare to every single person on the planet. It can be done. The problem is resources aren't equally distributed. Some countries and some classes of people have immense wealth, while others have little or nothing. And that's just, from a moral perspective, that's just fundamentally wrong and unfair. If someone works hard and makes a lot of money, I don't object. But if they have such phenomenal wealth, beyond what they can ever possibly spend, that is just wrong in a world of such abject poverty. And for people who've got 6 or 7 houses around the world and luxury yachts and planes, they'd be required to give up some of their wealth so that those who are dying can live. I won't go into details now, but one of my ideas is for Britain, in terms of the recession, austerity and public spending cuts, none of that's necessary. Apart from cancelling Trident nuclear missiles, which would save £100 billion over 40 years, apart from that, apart from closing the tax loopholes exploited by Vodafone, Boots and so on, which would save or raise an extra £30 billion a year, apart from ending pension tax relief on people earning over £100,000 a year, which would raise an extra 20 to 30 billion. Apart from all of that, there's the Tobin tax. If it was set, a financial transaction tax, if it was set at